The morning train slid into Red Mesa with a long sigh of iron, and dust climbed into the pale sky like breath from a tired horse. Sila, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped down with a canvas roll of blankets slung across her back and a small bundle of dried corn tied with twine. She had walked long distances before in worse weather, but the platform felt different from open country. Eyes gathered on her the way burrs gather on a hem. A boy laughed under his breath. A woman tugged her daughter behind her skirt. The signboard over the depot door creaked and nicked the quiet. Sila set her feet firm on the planks and breathed deep, counting heartbeats as she always did when a place tried to shrink her. She would sell the blankets, buy salt and needles, and keep moving west toward some work that lasted longer than a day. The merchant at the feed store ran a thumb under his suspenders and looked her over like a price tag. He told her there were already too many hands looking for work, that no one here needed another body eating supper and sleeping by the stove. He said he might take a blanket if it was not crooked, but then changed his mind when a pair of men in dust-stained hats smirked beside the seed barrels. One of them called her mountain-sized and the other asked if she could carry a mule on her shoulders for entertainment. Selah did not answer. There were words she could use and ways to use her hands, but she had promised her aunt not to stir trouble unless someone started the fight with fists and iron. She turned away, palms open, jaw tight. The laughter faded as she walked, but the shape of it clung like smoke. Red Mesa did not have many streets, only a main track where the boards were sound, and two alleys where rain carved ruts down toward the wash. Toward the west, a ridge broke the sky into steps, and the wind moved over it without hurry. The smell of coffee and frying fat drifted from a kitchen door. Selah followed it to a small eating room with 4 tables and 3 chairs that could be trusted. The woman behind the counter wore her hair in a tight gray rope, and her eyes were quick. She slid a tin cup of water across without comment and waited. Selah placed one blanket on the counter and said it was warm against night cold and light enough to ride with. The woman ran her hand over the weave and said it was good work. She bought the blanket and a second one, counted out coins, neat as seeds in a row, then added a heel of bread with salt rubbed into it. She told Selah to sit where the morning sun fell through the window and eat slow, and when the men who had smirked before came in, her eyes went hard like creek stones, and they decided to eat somewhere else. On the far side of the room near the empty stove, a man with a beard like weathered sage sat with his hat on his knee. He ate bacon as if each piece might be the last he would see that week, and he kept his gaze on the plate the way a careful rider keeps a hand close to the rein. His coat had been mended at least 3 times by someone who knew how to hide a stitch, and his boots had been resoled by someone with less patience. The woman called him Jonas and told him to quit chewing like a coyote, then refilled his coffee without asking. He answered her, "Yes, Mom, and thank you," with a voice that had lost its brightness somewhere between a drought and a funeral. When Sila finished the bread and folded the coins into a strip of cloth, Jonas put the hat on, slow, and came to her table. He did not crowd her. He said his windmill had a mind to quit turning, and his east fence lay down last week like a tired cow. He said he could use a strong pair of hands for a week, maybe 2, if those hands did not mind splinters and the sound of coyotes testing the dark. Sila measured the space between them and the way the woman behind the counter watched Jonas without fear. She asked how far his place stood from town and whether he paid in coins or rations, whether there was a roof to sleep under, and water that did not taste like nails. Jonas answered plain. His place was 8 miles west. His coins were honest. The roof let in starlight at one corner, but would do until it was fixed and the windmill water was clean if you pumped past the first cloudy part. He did not ask about her tribe or her past, and he did not try to make the work sound smaller than it was. She weighed his words as if they were stones she might tie to a line and drop into a river to test the depth. Then she nodded once. The woman at the counter slid a small bag of dried apples to Selah and told her to eat 2 at sundown and 2 at sunrise, no more, or her belly would cramp like a knotted rope. Jonas paid for the apples without pretending it was charity. They left the town with the sun burning a pale path across the ridge. Jonas rode a sorrel mare with a notch in one ear. Sila walked at a steady pace beside them, the canvas roll over her shoulder, the bundle of corn under her arm. They did not talk much. The road bore the prints of wagon wheels and the sharp marks of iron shoes. A hawk hung on the wind and watched field mice stripe the ground. Once near a dry arroyo, Jonas swung down to move a tumble of branches that would have spooked the mare. Sayla lifted the bundle with one hand and carried it aside like brushing crumbs from a table. Jonas nodded not in surprise, but in the way a man nods at a clean-cut board that fits where it should. When the wind turned colder, he offered her his scarf without ceremony. She refused, then took it when the wind sharpened again, tucking it around her throat where it held the little warmth a person could hold on to while walking into evening. Jonas Ranch appeared as a scatter of shapes against grass that had learned to live with little rain. A house with a porch, a barn with a door that listed a shed leaning against a corral as if they were old friends holding each other up. The windmill stood quiet and stubborn, a sentinel that had forgotten how to sing. A dog with a torn ear came to the edge of the yard and watched tail low, making no sound. Jonas spoke to it without looking, and the tail moved one side to side, the way a man might nod when told an old story he still likes. Silas set her roll down on the porch and stood letting the place look back at her. She felt the map of all her miles settle a little, as if this was a point she might circle and mark. The house smelled of sun-warmed wood and old coffee. The floor had been scrubbed, the table mended, the bedstead steady despite its age. There were 2 cups on a shelf and 1 plate with a chip shaped like a crescent moon. They ate beans and a shred of salt pork. Jonas said tomorrow they would set the windmill back to turning if the bearings had not chewed themselves raw. They would walk the east fence and stand up the posts that could be saved. He would show her where the ground turned spongy after a storm so she did not lose a boot to it. They would split cedar, not pine, because cedar keeps watch better against insects. His words were the kind that made a day visible in a mind before it arrived. Sayla listened while she unrolled her blanket on the floor by the stove, choosing the heat over the spare bed frame that had lost its rope. The dog lay near the door and thunked its tail once, then pretended to sleep. The wind leaned its shoulder against the house, and the roof answered with a small ticking sound where a nail had worked loose. In the night when the stove wore down to red ash and the house made the particular old sounds that houses make when they are trying to hold together, Sayla woke and lay still. The ceiling boards carried the faint smell of pitch. Somewhere very far away, a coyote called, and a second voice answered from a ridge. Sayla counted her breath slow like she had learned to do on nights when memory tried to argue with the present. She thought of the way the merchant had looked at her in town, and then of the way the woman at the counter had rubbed salt into the bread, and then of the way Jonas had said the word "we" without putting weight on it. She did not name it a promise. She did not name it anything. She turned on her side and wrapped her knees with the edge of the blanket and watched the iron mouth of the stove glow and breathe. When morning came, she would stand into the wind and learn the shape of this place with her hands, and the windmill would either turn again or it would not, and either way the day would rise, and they would meet it where it stood. The morning came in layers of pale gold and thin blue, and the windmill stood against it like a tall question. Jonas had coffee heating before the dog even stretched, and Sayla was outside rolling soreness out of her shoulders, palms open to the cold as if catching it. They walked to the tower with tools wrapped in a grain sack, speaking little, because the work in front of them made words feel like extra weight. Up close, the windmill looked like a stubborn old man who had fallen asleep on watch. The vane had a dent, 2 bolts were missing, and the gearhead wore a thin line of rust that promised to grow teeth if left alone. Jonas climbed first, testing each rung with a toe, and a patience that came from knowing how easily a day could go wrong. Sayla handed up the sack and followed her weight, steady her breathing as slow as fence post shadow. From the platform, the land spread away in every direction, like a big animal at rest, ribs rising and falling under grass. Jonas opened the gear housing and made a sound that said both trouble and relief. The bearings were not chewed through, after all, only dry and dirty, ashamed of being ignored. Sayla wiped the housing clean with cloth, moving in careful circles until old grit gave up and the metal showed its quiet shine. She packed grease in with 2 fingers and did not rush. Jonas worked a new cotter pin where the old one had sheared. When he tightened the last bolt, he leaned back and closed his eyes as if listening for something a person could not hear with only ears. He flicked the tail with a light touch. The fan turned slow at first, then found the wind and spun into a soft clatter like coins in a jar. Water answered from below with a thick gulp. Sayla felt the platform vibrate, a low, contented hum that traveled through steel and into bone. The dog barked once, surprised by luck. Back on the ground, they ran the pump until the first cloudiness moved through, and the water ran clear and clean cold as a promise kept. Sila cupped both hands and drank deep, then laughed quietly, a sound that startled the morning birds off the fence because it was new in this yard. Jonas did not make much of it, only filled a bucket and carried it to the trough with a stride that looked less tired than the day before. They ate cold beans and a heel of bread sitting on the porch steps, and he told her the lay of the place. The wash that ran wild after a storm and then pretended to be harmless for months. The little draw where quail hid and the soil held just enough to risk a kitchen garden, the far corner where the previous owner buried a dog, and 3 broken tools as if all of them had served equally. Sila listened and memorized. She liked to draw maps in her head, not with lines but with smells and sounds, and the way wind changed when it crossed shade. The east fence had fallen with the stubbornness of something that wanted attention. 3 posts had rotted out at the base, and wires sagged into a tease that would invite a straying steer, the first time curiosity outpaced sense. They stood the posts up and tamped soil the way a person presses a bruise, firm but not cruel. Jonas showed her how he likes to pull wire with a come-along steady and without jerks because quick strength breaks more than it fixes. When the tool slipped and bit his palm, Sila had the bandage unrolled before he could pretend it was nothing. The cut was shallow but messy. She cleaned it with boiled water, cooled in a cup the way her aunt had taught her, and wrapped it tight enough to remind the skin to mind itself. Jonas watched her hands and said only, "You save a man time when you move like that." Then he went back to work because praise can be as heavy as a sack of wet feed if you let it sit too long. By noon, the sun hammered without apology. They stepped into the shade of the barn, not because they were finished, but because even good tools hate to be held by a hand too hot. Inside smelled of old hay and horses that were gone and boards that remembered storms. A ladder slept against the wall, and a rope hung in a lazy curve from a beam. A single horseshoe had been nailed over the door long ago and forgotten. It held a little dust the way a memory holds a little ache. Jonas brought out a jar of pickles that had seen better days and a wedge of cheese that was still proud of itself. They ate standing the way people do when they will not let the day think it has them cornered. Sila asked him where he learned to mend things he had not been taught to mend, and Jonas said a place like this is a teacher if you listen before you argue. It was in the barn's shade that a rider came to the yard and called Jonas by his name, in a voice that tried to sound friendly and failed. The dog lifted its head, but did not bark, as if understanding that noise would not help this kind of moment. Jonas stepped into the sun, and Sila followed a half-pace behind. The rider wore a vest a shade too fine for honest work and a smile that flashed like a knife never used for food. He tipped his hat as if the gesture cost him and said he was Nash Porter Foreman for the Baxter spread to the south. He had heard the windmill had found its voice again and thought he would ride by to congratulate. Jonas said thanks and nothing more. Nash looked past him at Sila and let his smile widen the way a crack widens in a creek bed when heat presses long enough. He asked if Jonas had hired himself a full crew in one person. Sila did not shift her weight. Jonas answered that he hired hands who kept their promises and fences that stood, and he returned the smile to Nash like change for a purchase he had not wanted to make. Nash talked a little about water, how the Baxter cattle had been ranging wider since the dry spell, how strays did not read maps or mine fences low to the ground, how neighbors could save each other trouble if they made small agreements ahead of time. The words sounded like courtesy but smelled faintly of claim. Jonas said his troughs held what his windmill lifted, and he was willing to share at the far tank when the wash ran, as had always been the way. Nash nodded too quickly, then leaned on his horn and asked Sila if she planned to stand in the yard all day, or come over and lift his barn for him while she was at it. His laugh did not reach his eyes. Sila let the question fall to the dust and did not pick it up. When Nash turned his horse, he let his gaze browse over the place like a buyer at a sale, counting what there was to count. He said he would be back to talk neighbor sense and kicked his horse into a trot that raised dust without apology. For a while, the yard held his absence like a sound still ringing. Jonas pushed air out of his lungs and said Baxter had been sniffing around since the previous owner passed, looking to gather pieces of land the way a crow gathers shiny scraps. A place alone is a place easy to speak over. Sila said the windmill now sang louder than any man's voice. They went back to the fence because a day does not stop for a visitor who leaves his intentions behind him. They set 2 more posts and pulled wire until the line looked like a pencil mark you could trust. When the sun leaned west, they walked the pasture and checked for holes where a steer might test morals, and they found a low, damp patch where reeds still tried and made a small note in their shared map for later. On the way back, Jonas showed her the stone where his wife used to set a bowl of apples when there were apples, and he did not use many words to do it. Selah placed her hand on that stone and left it there a heartbeat longer than necessary. Evening brought the first honest cool. Silas started a stew with beans and a handful of dried apples cut small, and Jonas added a scrap of pork like a secret. The smell lifted into the room and softened corners that had been hard all day. While it cooked, Sila mended the sleeve of Jonah's coat where a seam had loosened her needle stitching, the way a person might speak to a skittish colt steady without surprise. Jonas whittled at a piece of cedar and made a shape that had no name, but held peace. When they ate slow, and when they finished, the dogs sighed and pretended to be asleep again, the way dogs do when they want you to know they are on duty without making a fuss about it. Outside, the windmill turned, and the trough ticked full measure by measure. In the deep part of the evening, after dishes were dried and put away like coins in their places, Jonas brought out a small tin of salve and set it on the table. He nodded at the skin of Sila knuckles where wire had paid its price. She pretended she had not noticed the blood there, then held out her hands. He dabbed the salve with the care of a man who had once learned to hold something fragile and had not forgotten even if the thing itself was gone. The room held that quiet without apology. Silas said tomorrow they should shore up the shed wall before wind found it. Jonas said tomorrow they should do exactly that, and after they would walk the draw and listen for quail, because listening teaches a person more than chasing. The stove murmured. The windmill breathed. The house with its loose nail ticking a soft rhythm felt a little less like a structure and a little more like a promise being practiced. Before sleep, Selah stepped onto the porch and watched the yard. Stars came on like small brave fires, and the ridge kept its shape against the sky. She thought about Nash Porter and the way his words bent around the truth, and she thought about fences that had to be made to stand not only against cattle but against hunger that wore a human face. She did not wish for a fight, but she did not flinch from the knowledge that some days arrive carrying one. She closed the door softly so the dog would not pretend to wake. Inside, she lay by the stove again, because warmth felt like a companion that did not ask questions. She counted her breaths until the house's sounds matched them. When sleep found her, it did so without claws. In the quiet before dawn, the wind turned the blades again, and water answered, and a small part of the land settled into the idea that it was being kept, not just used. The next morning cracked open with a sky brushed in gray, and the faint scent of rain that might never arrive. Jonas moved with the habit of years stacking wood and checking the stock trough, while Silas swept the porch with a bundle of twigs bound tight. The dog trailed after both of them, as though afraid the day would choose sides. The shed wall leaned worse than Jonas remembered. Its boards bowed like tired backs, and the roof had settled enough to whisper of collapse. Sila tested each plank with her palms, hearing the language of wood that had endured too many storms. She told Jonas the uprights could still be saved if braced before noon. Jonas fetched cedar poles, and together they worked, setting braces at angles sharp as resolve. Sweat carved lines through dust on their arms. But when the last nail drove home, the shed exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath too long. They paused by the well-drinking water, cold enough to set teeth humming. Jonas looked toward the ridge and said he had heard coyotes bold enough to test fences last night. Selah listened, hearing not only the land but the spaces between sounds. She told him in her people's way of speaking that when coyotes sang close, it was not only hunger, but a measure of whether the place had keepers. Jonas nodded, the kind of nod that respects more than it understands. He said then the coyotes had been measuring wrong because the place had keepers now. The dog, as if agreeing, lifted its nose and barked once sharp and certain, then wagged its tail like punctuation. Later they walked to the draw where quail nested. The ground dipped gentle, holding a dampness that coaxed green shoots even in dry months. Sila knelt and touched the earth fingers, sinking into coolness. She said a kitchen garden would live here. Beans and squash, first maybe corn if water held. Jonas crouched beside her, eyeing the slope and the way shade fell. He told her his wife once tried tomatoes, but the soil grew stubborn and the vines refused. Silas smiled faint, saying tomatoes were always stubborn, like children who choose their own path. Jonas laughed low a sound, rough from disuse but real. It carried across the draw, startling a covey into flight wings a sudden thunder. Both of them looked up following the rise of the birds, and for a moment their silence was shared joy, not the wary quiet of strangers. That afternoon, clouds built on the horizon, heavy with a promise they might or might not keep. Jonas patched the barn roof while Selah hauled stones from the wash to weight the corners of tarps. She worked without complaint, her muscles moving like river currents, steady and sure. When Jonas climbed down, he handed her a square of jerky and said she reminded him of the river itself, cutting its way, whether men liked it or not. She chewed the meat eyes, narrowing with thought, then said, "Rivers carve land, but also carry burdens away." Jonas considered this and admitted he carried burdens that had not yet found a river. Sila did not press him. She only placed another stone on the tarp, sealing the barn against the storm that might come. Toward evening, a rider appeared at the edge of the pasture, dust trailing like smoke. It was Nash Porter again, but this time he brought two other men, both broad-shouldered, their hands, resting casual on reins, yet never far from holsters. They halted by the fence, and Nash called out, voice bright as false silver, asking whether Jonas had thought more about neighborly agreements. Jonas walked out, slow, rifle not in his hands, but leaning easy against his shoulder. Selah stayed near the barn, a hammer in her grip, her gaze level. Nash's smile bent at the corners when he noticed her stance. He said the Baxters would soon drive cattle across the ridge, and a broken fence might let animals wander. Jonas replied that his fences stood, his land was marked, and his neighbors could respect that as well as he respected theirs. The air thickened, carrying more weight than words alone. One of Nash's men spat into the dirt, eyes flicking at Sila, as if she were part of the land to be claimed or dismissed. She met his look without flinching, black eyes steady as basalt. Silence stretched, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the distant bark of a crow. At last, Nash chuckled and said he meant no harm, only wished to keep the peace. Jonas answered that peace stayed stronger when men did not lean too hard on it. The words held steel, quiet but unbending. After a beat, Nash turned his horse, muttering about storms on the horizon. The three riders trotted off, leaving dust and the taste of threat behind them. Jonas stood until they were specks against the sky, then lowered his rifle. Sila came to his side, and neither spoke of fear, though both felt its shape like a shadow stretched long. Night came with a red sunset and a wind that smelled of rain. Inside the house, Selah stirred a pot of beans while Jonas trimmed a piece of wood into something shapeless but patient. The dog lay with ears pricked, unwilling to relax fully. When thunder grumbled, distant Jonas said the land was restless, and Selah answered that restless land was honest. Unlike men who smiled too wide. He looked at her, then really looked, and saw the line of scars across her arms, the strength that did not ask pardon. He said she carried storms inside her and still stood. She met his gaze steady and said, "Storms cleanse as much as they destroy." Neither pushed the thought further, but when they ate, the silence felt less heavy, more like a blanket worn soft by use. Rain arrived at last, drumming on the roof, slipping through the loose nail with drops that pattered on the floor. Sila moved her blanket aside and set a pot beneath the leak, her movements practical, unbothered. Jonas watched her and thought of how many nights he had cursed that leak alone. He said tomorrow they would mend it. She nodded, then lay down again near the stove. Jonas settled into his chair, pipe smoke, curling, and the dog shifted closer to her feet as if declaring its choice of company. Outside, the rain ran into the wash, into the draw, into the waiting earth. Inside, two people who had once been measured and found wanting now measured the night together, and the house, old, patched, imperfect, felt stronger for it. The storm did not break all at once. It pressed through the night in waves, heavy, then thin, as though the sky could not decide whether to spend its anger or save it. Jonas dozed in his chair, hat tilted low, pipe cold between his teeth. Sila lay awake, watching firelight bend across the rafters, listening to the rain tap through the loose nail into the waiting pot. She remembered nights beneath open sky when storms meant no shelter, only wet blankets and the ache of waiting for dawn. Here, even with leaks and winds seeping through cracks, there was a roof. The thought made her chest feel both heavy and lighter than air. When the first pale light of morning pushed through the cloud bank, the storm's back had broken. The ground steamed, the air smelled of wet cedar and new earth. Jonas stepped out onto the porch and let the rain soak into his boots, saying the land would drink well today. Scylla joined him, pulling her blanket around her shoulders, and for a long moment they stood silent, watching rivulets carve fresh scars down the yard. The dog ran circles, rolling in mud, as if celebrating survival. Jonas chuckled once, a short sound, and said a dog knew better than most when to give thanks. Work waited. The fence line had sagged where water softened the posts, and the wash carried branches that lodged against the far side. Jonas and Scylla took to it together, boots sinking in mud, hands raw against soaked wood. When a post snapped clean at its base, Scylla lifted it single-handed and dragged it out, her muscles straining but unshaken. Jonas nodded, not in surprise but in respect, and cut a fresh cedar length with careful strokes. They set it deep, tamping wet soil until water squelched up around their boots. The work left them soaked through, but when the wire stretched taut again, it hummed a low note like a string pulled true. By midday, the clouds broke apart, scattering sunlight across the valley. Jonas built a small fire outside to dry their clothes. Scylla sat nearby, steam rising from her shirt scars along her arms glistening. Jonas noticed her watching the flames with a faraway gaze, and he asked where her thoughts walked. She told him of a time when her people gathered by fire, how stories passed not in books but in smoke and song, how she had once been too tall, too broad, and laughed at even among her own. Jonas poked at the fire with a stick and said, loneliness had its own dialect, one he knew well. The admission hung between them, not pity but a bridge. Scylla did not answer, only leaned closer to the fire, letting its warmth find her bones. That evening they mended the roof where the leak had bled all night. Jonas steadied the ladder, and Scylla climbed nails and hammer in her belt. The boards were slick, but her balance was sure. Each strike of the hammer echoed down through the house like a drum. Jonas kept one hand firm on the ladder, not because he doubted her, but because habit taught him storms always found the weak point. When she came down, sweat streaking mud from her forehead, he handed her a dipper of water. She drank, then grinned faint, the kind of grin that slips past walls before you notice. Jonas felt something stir in him, not quick or loud, but steady like a seed remembering how to grow. The next day brought riders. Not Nash this time, but two men with Baxter brand on their saddles. They came with loose smiles and sharp eyes, asking about water rights, claiming their cattle had strayed during the storm. Jonas stood firm, saying strays were welcome to be collected, but not to linger. Scylla watched from the porch, arms crossed, every line of her body carved in defiance. The men looked her over too long, trading smirks until Jonas's voice cut sharp, telling them business was finished. They left with words like dust promising return. Silence filled the yard after heavy as a storm yet to break. That night by firelight, Scylla sharpened her knife while Jonas smoked his pipe. The dog lay between them, ears twitching at sounds neither of them heard. Jonas said trouble would come sooner than later, and Scylla replied that trouble always came, but it mattered who met it at the door. Their eyes met across the glow, and for a breath both understood they were no longer strangers standing in borrowed silence. They were keepers of one house, one fence, one fragile piece of land that needed defending. Outside, the wind turned the blades of the mended windmill water, spilling into the trough, steady as heartbeat. Inside, two lives scarred, stubborn, waiting, leaned towards something unspoken but real. The following morning dawned with a brittle stillness, the kind that warned of things moving beneath the quiet. Jonas saddled the mare and rode the fence line while Scylla carried tools to the barn, her steps steady against the damp soil. The dog shadowed her ears, sharp nose twitching at scents carried on the wind. When Jonas returned, he said the Baxter cattle had not crossed the line yet, but their tracks pressed heavy near the ridge. He spat into the dust, muttering that men who let herds wander close to another's fence were not careless but testing. Scylla listened, wiping her palms clean on her skirt, and answered that animals follow the lead of men. If the herd pressed, it was because its owners wanted it so. Jonas gave a slow nod, the kind that marked agreement without softening the weight of it. That day they chose not to wait. They shored the corral, tightened ropes, and stacked barrels near the porch as makeshift cover. Jonas set fresh oil in the rifle, every movement deliberate. Scylla tied her hair back, tucking strands behind ears scarred from old fights, then walked the perimeter with her knife-drawn tracing paths like a sentry. It was not fear in her steps, but memory she had guarded before, and she knew the rhythm of waiting. The sun slid down hard, dragging long shadows across the yard, and the air thickened with the smell of grass bruised under hooves far off. Jonas and Silas shared a meal of cornbread and beans, neither speaking much, listening instead to the silence that comes before a storm. The dog whined low, not from hunger, but from knowing. By dusk, dust rose at the ridge. 3 riders this time, with Nash Porter leading, their silhouettes cut against the blood-red horizon, moving unhurried like men certain of their claim. Jonas stepped to the porch, rifle across his arm but not raised. Silas stood beside him, tall and unbending, her knife glinting in the last light. Nash called out, his voice carrying smooth across the distance. He said the Baxters meant no quarrel, only that water ran free and neighbors ought to share. Jonas answered that neighbors shared when asked, not when threatened, and his land had its keeper now. His words rang steady as steel struck true. Nash's smile thinned, and one of his men shifted in the saddle hand, brushing the butt of his pistol. Silas' gaze locked on him, black eyes sharp as arrowheads. Silence held stretched, and in that silence the first star pricked the sky. Nothing broke that night, though the threat lingered like smoke. The riders turned back, dust swallowing them, but Jonas knew it was not an end. After they sat by the stove, the room lit gold by lamplight. Jonas smoked, Selah sharpened her blade, and the dog lay watchful. Jonas said trouble would come harder next time. Selah answered that she had lived her whole life with trouble and had not fallen yet. He looked at her then, long and quiet, and said a house stood stronger, with 2 walls braced together. She met his gaze, not flinching, and for the first time she let herself believe he meant her as one of those walls. The next days were spent in work that felt like building armor. They cut timber, mended. The barn door filled the root cellar with sacks of grain. Jonas taught her how to load the colt he kept hidden under the bed, and she taught him how to listen for footsteps through soil when the wind carried too still. Each night as the fire burned low, their silences grew different, less wary, more woven. When Jonas's hand brushed hers once, while passing a cup, neither drew back. When Selah laughed at the dog's clumsy chase of a rabbit, Jonas found himself smiling before he realized. Small things, but in a land where storms came hard, small things were seeds. The storm came sooner than they hoped. One night, with the moon veiled and coyotes silent, hooves thundered near. Torches flared at the fence line, voices shouting. Jonas snapped the lamp-low rifle in hand, while Selah pulled her knife free and crouched near the door. The dog growled, deep hackles stiff. Shadows moved across the yard. Nash and his men, 6 this time, circling like wolves. One called out, demanding water rights, demanding the woman, demanding submission. Jonas answered with a gunshot into the dirt, his voice iron saying this land did not bow. Firelight painted the boards red as the men shouted back, and the night tightened into a single held breath. When the first bullet cracked, the world erupted. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and the dog leapt with a snarl. Selah fired the carbine Jonas had placed in her hands, days before the recoil slamming her shoulder, but her aim true. One rider tumbled. Jonas's rifle spoke again, measured, precise. Torches flew fire, licking the barn's roof. Selah charged through smoke knife, flashing her cry deep as drumbeat. Jonas pulled a man down with the butt of his rifle, driving him into the dirt. The yard became a storm of hooves, shouts, and fire. But through it all, 2 figures stood unbroken. The weathered rancher and the cast-out warrior, fighting not only for land, but for the fragile thread of home they had begun to weave together. The barn roof caught fast flames, chewing through dry thatch like a hungry animal. Smoke rolled low in thick, stinging eyes and throats, turning night into a battlefield painted orange. Jonas shouted for Selah to fall back, but she had already leapt into the fray, her tall frame cutting through the chaos like a storm-given flesh. She dragged a torch from one man's hand, hurled it into the dirt, and drove her knife in a circle of sparks. The rider reeled, blood blooming his scream, swallowed by the roar of fire. Jonas covered her flank rifle, cracking steady. Each shot deliberate, cold, the way a man fights who has seen too many wars and swore never again until someone forced his hand. The dog darted through smoke, snapping at boots, forcing riders off balance. One man swung at it with the butt of a pistol, but Jonas's bullet found him first, sending him sprawling lifeless into mud. Scylla grappled with another near the corral, their bodies slamming against rails that creaked and threatened to break. She seized his wrist, twisted until bone gave, then shoved him aside with a force that sent him tumbling into the trough. Water sloshed crimson, his curses bubbling into silence. All around the yard burned bright, yet within that ring of fire, Jonas and Scylla moved like two halves of the same blade. Nash Porter rode close, face lit by fire pistol leveled. His smile was gone now, replaced by the pale mask of a man who had expected fear and found defiance instead. "You can't hold forever," he shouted above the flames. "This place isn't yours to keep." Jonas stepped forward, rifle steady, and answered low but sharp. "A man keeps what he builds with his hands, not what he steals with his threats." Scylla's voice joined his fierce, rising from the smoke. "And a woman is no one's to claim." Her words cracked like thunder rolling across the yard. Nash flinched, his pistol wavering, and for a moment the fight faltered. But rage drove him. He spurred his horse, charging straight for Jonas. In the instant before iron met flesh, Scylla lunged, grabbing the reins, yanking the beast sideways. Nash toppled, hitting the ground hard. His gun fired wild, the shot grazing Jonas's sleeve. Dirt and sparks sprayed as Scylla pinned him, one knee across his chest, knife at his throat. Nash choked breath, hot with whiskey and fear. "End me then," he spat. Her hand trembled, blade glinting inches from his skin. For a heartbeat, the fire demanded blood, but Jonas's voice cut through enough. "A life taken is a shadow that never leaves." Scylla froze, chest heaving. Slowly she drew the knife away, leaving Nash pale and gasping. She rose tall and unbroken while Jonas pulled him to his feet and shoved him toward the dark. "Go back," Jonas said, steel in his tone, "and tell your Baxters this land stands guarded." The raiders fled, dragging their wounded, leaving smoke, hoofbeats, and curses in their wake. The yard stank of gunpowder and burning wood. The barn sagged, half its roof gone, but still standing. Scylla leaned against the fence, breath, ragged blood seeping from a gash in her shoulder. Jonas was there in an instant, tearing cloth from his own shirt, binding her wound with hands rough yet careful. Their eyes met through the haze of smoke, his gray weathered and steady, hers black, fierce and blazing. No words were spoken, but something passed between them, solid as the ground beneath their boots. When dawn finally broke, pale light washed over ruin and survival alike. The barn roof smoldered, fence posts stood blackened, and ash drifted like snow. Yet the house still stood, the well still ran, and two figures stood side by side on the porch, scarred but unbent. Scylla's voice was quiet, hoarse from smoke, but steady. "Last night, I was not fighting alone." Jonas set a hand on her shoulder, firm and certain, and answered, "Nor ever again if you choose." She looked at the yard, at the battered boards and charred beams, then back at him. Her reply was not words, but the silence of someone who had finally found where they belonged. Together they stepped down into the ash, already thinking of how to build anew. The days that followed were filled with the kind of work that leaves no room for sorrow until night falls. Jonas and Scylla rose before the sun, clearing charred beams from the barn, stacking what could be saved, burning what was beyond use. The dog padded beside them, tail wagging each time they paused, as though reminding them that life still beat steady beneath the smoke. Neighbors passed now and then on the road, slowing their horses to stare, whisper, then moving on. Some shook their heads as if certain the place would not stand another season. Others tipped their hats in quiet respect. Jonas paid them no mind. Scylla met each gaze, head on her shoulders, square, daring anyone to speak aloud what they muttered under breath. Each evening, when muscles ached and hands split from splinters, they sat on the porch with bowls of stew made from beans and whatever jerky remained. Silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. Once Jonas asked if she missed her people. Scylla answered after a long pause that she had never truly belonged even among them. He said he understood, and she knew by the weight in his voice that he did. Another night she asked him if he ever dreamed of leaving. He told her he had many times, but each time the land held him stubborn as barbed wire. She nodded, saying the land held her now too. They left it at that, but the unspoken grew between them like roots weaving unseen beneath soil. Rumors from town carried back on the wind. Nash Porter was gone, sent away licking his wounds, but Baxter's anger had not cooled. Men in the saloon spoke of unfinished business of cattle, driven closer to test lines again. Jonas kept his rifle clean, his eyes watchful. Scylla took to walking the ridge at dawn, her tall frame a dark mark against the sky so that anyone watching knew this land did not stand empty. The dog followed, barking at shadows, chasing off scavenger birds. The place had changed. It was no longer a lonely ranch clinging to survival. It had guardians visible and unyielding. One evening, as the sun bled over the horizon, Sayla sat on the porch steps, her hand resting against her belly without thought. Jonas watched from the doorway, pipe smoke curling. When she noticed, she dropped her hand, but the gesture had already spoken. Jonas stepped forward, sitting beside her, his knees cracking like old timbers. He did not ask, only waited. After a long silence, she said, voice barely above a whisper, "Life may be growing inside me." Jonas looked out at the fields, eyes wet in the corners, though his voice stayed steady. "Then we build not just for us, but for what comes next." Sayla exhaled as if a weight she had carried too long finally eased. In the quiet that followed, the dog laid its head across her feet, and the stars came out one by one like blessings. The weeks turned, and the ranch bore signs of healing. New beams rose on the barns straighter than the old. The garden sprouted green shoots where damp earth held water. The windmill clattered, steady lifting life from the deep ground. Townsfolk who once mocked now came with quiet trades, flour for blankets, nails for hides. No one laughed at the tall Apache woman anymore when she walked beside the rancher. Instead, they stepped aside, some in respect, some in caution, all knowing the two had faced fire and lived. Jonas never let go of her hand in the street, not once. Every time he did it, the whispers grew softer until even the cruelest eyes looked away. When the doctor from Prescott arrived 1 month later, he carried a black bag and the kind of half-smile men wear when they bring both worry and hope. He examined Sala with careful hands, nodded, and said the child was strong. Jonas sat on the porch after staring at the land, while the words settled into him like rain after drought. Scylla joined him, leaning her head against his shoulder. Neither spoke, but their silence brimmed with something larger than words, something that bound them tighter than fire or blood. The dog barked at the horizon as if announcing the news to the valley. On the final night of summer, the prairie stretched beneath a sky thick with stars. Jonas and Sayla sat together, watching the wind ripple through grass that shone silver in moonlight. The scars of battle still marked the barn bullet holes in porch posts, still whispered of violence, yet the place stood stronger for it. Jonas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steady and unhurried, a choice not of impulse, but of life. Sayla rested her hand on his fingers, rough yet gentle, and whispered, "I never thought I would live to call any place home." Jonas pressed his cheek against her hair and said, "You are home now." In that moment, two souls once broken by loss and rejection were no longer alone. They were family. The prairie wind carried their breath into the night, weaving it with the sound of crickets and the far-off cry of coyotes who now kept their distance. And the house, patched and scarred, glowed in the dark like a fortress built not of stone, but of love and trust.